Why doesn't God do something? It was a small convent, but there was much to do. There had been a war in the land, followed by famine, and the queues of helpless people were sometimes overwhelming. The sisters had to work overtime to help protect and feed the victims, but the Mother Superior also ensured that no one neglected their prayers. All the nuns went to services and had at least some quiet time for prayer. All, that is, except one. Sister Agnes didn't turn up for prayers very often, and when she did, she had what seemed to be a pained expression on her face. She spent most of her time in the infirmary, giving what medical help she could to the victims of the troubles outside the convent gates. The Mother Superior called Sister Agnes to her study. She asked why the young nun seemed so reluctant to come to prayers. "The truth is, Mother Superior," said Sister Agnes, "I think I have lost my faith." "And what makes you believe that?" "It is difficult for me to believe that if there is a loving God, that he would allow his children to suffer as these poor people have." The Mother Superior thought for a moment, then she said, "There is only one solution to that problem, my child. If you have a question about God, you must ask him. I am removing you from all duties except one. You must spend your time asking God why he allows suffering to exist. My advice is that you ask him one question. Why don't you do something about the suffering of your children?" "But there is so much to do," said the nun. "Nevertheless, you may not return to your duties until you have received an answer," said the Mother Superior. Sister Agnes was not seen at all over the next few days, except in the chapel. Those who looked closely could see her lips moving with the question, "Why don't you do something?" One morning, on the 5th day, the Mother Superior was surprised to see a cheerful-looking Sister Agnes back at work. She waited until the nun had dealt with some of the worst cases among the victims, then pulled her aside. "You were to ask God why he didn't do something about the suffering. Have you received an answer?" "Yes," said Sister Agnes. "I asked him over and over why he didn't do anything to help. Last night, he gave me an answer. He said, 'But I did do something. I made you.'"
Hello. I would say good morning because it's still morning here in my workroom. But I have no idea what time it is where you are. So instead I'll say greetings. Let me ask you a question. How do you end a letter? Do you say yours truly or sincerely or warm regards or whatever? I struggle with that. I've never known how to do that properly, and sometimes I don't put anything at all, but recently I've been saying blessings. And I do that realizing that I have come through a period in which that word, that very idea, was to me a bit challenging. Because I always associated blessing with that thing that a black-robed priest smelling of incense in the high church does when he lays his hands on you as if he's conveying, zapping you with some kind of specially ordained blessing, and he's a direct conduit to God. But my confusion about the meaning of that blessing reached a crisis point once, many years ago when I was in ministry training. We students were called upon from time to time to do funeral services for people who died at a very advanced age, didn't have many relatives, perhaps in a nursing home. And there would be very few people there, sometimes only 2 or 3. And the whole process was a little bit alienating. Well, I was called to do one once, and I was doing it with an old man who died in a nursing home and outlived all his relatives. While I was doing the service, reading the sort of pre-prepared eulogy that had been given to me, I noticed that there was one old man sitting in the second row who was sobbing. He wasn't just weeping quietly. His shoulders were heaving, and you could tell that he was somehow profoundly affected with grief. And that surprised me. And afterwards, when I was standing at the main door to speak to people on their way out, I saw that he was heading directly towards me with this very sort of purposeful gait. And I thought, uh-oh, I may be called upon to do something I'm not trained for. He got next to me and he put his hands out like this and he grabbed hold of my arm and said, "Father, bless me." Well, I wasn't a father, and the whole idea of being able to bless someone was brand new to me, and I didn't know what to do, but I realized that he needed something, and that if he didn't get it from me, he probably was not going to get it at all. So I just took his hands and said, "It's all right. It's all right." He brightened, took a breath, and walked out of there seeming like a much different man, and just left me standing there with the mystery just beginning in my own head. Was that blessing? I hope that no one comes up to me anytime these days and says, "Father, please bless me." But if they do, I think I'll know what happened before. Because when I said to him, "It's all right," I seemed to understand that, yes, it was all right. I seemed to know that it was true that the whole sad story of humanity, the death of his old neighbor, his death, my death, the death of everything, was somehow, inexplicably, all right. And so I learned that blessing doesn't need to come from the ether, doesn't need to be conducted down holy fingertips, doesn't need to be broadcast like a radio beam. That blessing is something that each one of us can do, that each one of us does do already, whether we know it or not. There are times when a simple expression on your face can carry a blessing. When the touch of a hand or a smile exchanged with a stranger evokes some evidence of that same all rightness of things. Well, there's this phrase that we've all heard. It's been part of the cultural background of all of our lives for as long as most of us can remember. It comes from the Rabbi Jesus when he said, "Bless those who curse you." It's so familiar to our ears that we can't actually even hear it. It's obviously honored more in the breach than the observance, but it's nonetheless, it's there as part of our cultural heritage. Bless those who curse you. Well, Roman and Greek laws, for example, out of which we all sprang, were full of these statutes which were really what you'd call tit for tat, enshrining revenge as a model of justice. If an architect built an arch and that arch collapsed and killed or injured people underneath, the architect would be crushed by bricks himself. The bloodthirsty punishments of ancient Judaism had things like stoning for adultery, and that was commonplace. But into that, here came this itinerant preacher, this young man, telling his listeners to love those who hate you and to bless those who curse you. Well, like so much of official Christian speak, those words sit isolated in a few hymns and sermons, while the culture that draws its basic root identity from that religion acts completely differently. And that's not at all surprising when you think about it. How exactly are you supposed to bless somebody who wishes you harm? We know in our very bones that, well, like when the kids take you out behind the bike shed and beat you up when you're just a little kid, the big bullies, or the politicians defy sense and order and do something that's just so unjust that it seems to pollute the whole environment. How are you supposed to love them? So when Jesus said these things to his followers, it wouldn't have made a lot of sense, really. What's more, he seemed even to be saying that the suppressed Jews, people who were oppressed by the Roman occupants, shouldn't feel negatively about the Romans themselves. This was the live issue of that day, and it must have been responsible for a lot of the antagonism that ultimately led to his crucifixion. We're pretty sure that at least Judas, the revolutionary, wasn't buying into it. So why didn't this rabbi just slip into obscurity like so many other preachers? Well, I think the answer to that question may be the most important mystery that lies at the heart of all religions. For some reason, those words are strangely titillating. Bless those who curse you. Reminds me of that other beautiful and apparently nonsensical thing that the Rabbi Jesus said when he said, "Take no heed of the morrow. Behold, the lilies of the field, they spin not, neither do they weave." It seems to resonate in some corner of our sleeping hearts like a trace of a lovely dream which we have forgotten upon awakening. It's as if in some part of ourselves we sense that that is indeed true, but we can't quite make out the connection with what happens in what we refer to as the real world. Well, I think that Jesus and others like him were living in a slightly different world. That universe touches ours, but it overlaps and transcends it. And he called it the kingdom of heaven. It's not a bad name when you think about it. He also seemed to indicate that it was not something that happened later or somewhere else, but right here, right now. His words, which are often repeated in the Synoptic Gospels, are always, that kingdom is at hand. And while his followers were physically alongside him, trudging the same dusty sandal tracks as he did, experiencing the same weather, he was living as a citizen, some would say the very first citizen of a different world. Well, in this world, it was not so hard to forgive your enemies, nor to give from your substance rather than your spare change. The ordinary boundaries of success, things like winning in political revolution, getting rich, getting famous, having a wonderful reputation, they were all secondary to what seems to be another kind of reward, one that we can't quite make out. Some people who came afterwards seem to have some idea about it, sort of imitated what Jesus said, and we have a name for them. In Christianity, they're called saints. They knew that you can't decide how you feel about somebody who does you harm. So this matter of blessing your enemies isn't a matter of willpower or brainwashing yourself into a hypocritical series of actions. That simply doesn't work. It won't work unless you're actually in touch with the rules of this other kingdom. Then it appears it all becomes natural, more natural than the automatic response that we have of hatred and revenge. Okay, Art, that's all very well, but where does that leave us ordinary people who can't yet make out the road signs of this other kingdom? If we wish to bless those who curse us, how can we even attempt it without being somewhat hypocritical? Isn't blessing still really reserved for those that we love and those we identify with? Well, blessing is and has to be blind. It can't be a reward for good or profitable use to ourselves. That isn't blessing at all. When attempting to bless someone who you might prefer to curse, who you might prefer to get even with, the thing to remember is that we have reason to believe, good reason to believe, that there exists a point of view just outside our reach that makes sense of all that makes things work out in the end. That same something about which is said that it binds the wounds and dries the tears and restores the lost. And though, no, we are not quite there yet, we intuit its existence enough to forego our visceral promptings of hatred, of resentment, and revenge, because we feel, can't prove it, but we feel that that's the real source of blessing. And you know what? That's the best we can do. So bless you all. Bless me too.